Time for the latest earnings outlook now with Research Director Shiraz Mian. Well, we're about halfway through earnings season, or a little bit better. Overall tone of this fourth quarter earnings season, weak. At least weaker than we've seen in the past quarters. Shiraz Mian, our Research Director here, describes it, though, as not too hot and not too cold. And so I have to ask you, what do you mean by that?
Well, the not too hot means that we have had some really impressive run in earnings growth throughout this earnings cycle, and we are now more than 10 quarters into this earnings cycle. So there were a bunch of apprehensions getting into the fourth quarter as to how bad potentially earnings numbers could turn out to be. They were not as good as we have seen in the prior quarters, but they were not as bad as some of those for choice of a better word, fear mongers were making us afraid of. So not too bad, not too good. I'm calling it not too hot, not too cold.
Okay, but you can't say Goldilocks because it's not just right. There is a weaker tone.
There is a weaker tone. There's definitely a weaker tone. It's both in the growth numbers, which was expected. The number of companies coming ahead of expectations, that was not unexpected either. But the overall macro backdrop in which these companies operate, whether it's Europe, whether it's questions about emerging markets, all of those are weaker than what we have seen in the past. So and we are hearing that from management teams as well. So the overall tone for corporate profitability going forward is definitely weak.
So what about the net margin growth or lack of? Is that becoming worrisome to you at this point?
I'm not terribly worried about it, primarily because it is not unexpected. We have been seeing over the last 2-3 quarters now that margins, which were primarily the major driver for earnings growth earlier on in the cycle, were kind of topping off. So we had less of the earnings growth coming from margin expansion and more from top-line gains, and we are seeing more of that trend play out in the fourth quarter earnings. We still saw some year-over-year expansion in terms of margin, but just in a handful of sectors. Predominantly, margins are flat to down for most of the sectors, but you would expect that at this stage in the earnings cycle. As I mentioned, we are in the third year of the recovery. Most of the easy gains in terms of margin expansion have already taken place.
So because of this slow growth or slowed growth, what are your expectations for this year?
The good thing that I'm seeing in terms of the earnings expectations for this year, for 2012, is that downward revision that we have been seeing consistently over the last 4 or 5 months, that seems to be decelerating, meaning that growth expectations for 2012 are stabilizing now, which is a good thing, because it was the uncertainty about the growth outlook for 2012 that a number of people were kind of wrestling with. I'm not saying that the current growth expectations of like the high single digits or up to 10-11% as well, those would be realized. There's probably still some room for downward adjustments to the estimates for 2012, but overall we are closer to the mark than we were 3-4 months ago, and that is net a positive thing.
And is that why you wrote recently in one of your commentaries that earnings are not going to be a major catalyst for stocks here in the coming months?
That comment is in a context of a short-term outlook for stocks. So I was basically explaining that that more than half of the earnings reports are out now, and investors have a pretty good feel for how this earnings season has been, and we have about 2.5 to 3 months still to go for the next earnings season to kick in. So the next 2-3 months, earnings will no longer be a catalyst for stocks. That was the context for that comment.
I see. Okay, well, we'll have to see how this all shakes out and wraps up for the fourth quarter season. In the meantime, you can always take a look at Shiraz's most recent thoughts on not only earnings, but the market and other developments around the world that affect stocks in the stock market each day in the Ahead of Wall Street column on Zacks.com. With Shiraz, I'm Terry Ruffalo.